The courtroom was eerily quiet as Judge Richard Morrow leaned forward, glaring down at the teenage girl in the witness chair. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "You lied," he said firmly, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. The girl, a 16-year-old named Emily Parker, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had short, dark hair that framed her face, and her eyes, a deep shade of brown, gleamed with a quiet confidence that unsettled even the most seasoned lawyers in the room. She wore a simple white blouse and black skirt, her expression unreadable except for the slight curve of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I didn't lie, Your Honor," she replied smoothly, her voice steady and calm. Judge Morrow's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Then prove it," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We'll play a little game, truth or lie. I ask a question, you answer, and if I catch you in a lie, we'll know exactly what kind of witness you are." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A game? The idea seemed ludicrous. The bailiff, who had been standing rigidly by the door, took a small step closer. Everyone in the room was now fully engaged. Even the prosecutor, who had been quiet up until that point, leaned forward, eager to see how the young girl would respond. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying Judge Morrow as though trying to determine whether he was serious. "You want to play a game of truth or lie with me, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Judge Morrow straightened, his chair creaking under his weight. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned like this, especially by someone so young, but he couldn't back down now. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "Are you afraid?" Emily's lips curved into a smile. "You should be, Your Honor," she replied coolly, her gaze never leaving his. "Ask yourself that question." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge, taken aback by her confidence, cleared his throat. There was something about this girl, something in her eyes, that unsettled him. The game had just begun, but it already felt like he was the one being played. 3 weeks earlier, Emily had been sitting in the back row of the courtroom, watching a theft trial unfold. She wasn't on trial. She wasn't even a witness. She was simply fascinated by the way the law worked, the way words and evidence could twist and turn, shaping reality itself. While most of her friends spent their weekends playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Emily spent hers reading law books and dissecting court cases. That day, the trial she attended was a straightforward one. A man had been accused of stealing from a grocery store. The evidence was weak at best, and the defense attorney seemed hopelessly unprepared. Emily had noticed the discrepancies right away. She had seen the inconsistencies in the security footage timestamps, the discrepancies in the witness statements, and when the verdict was announced, she couldn't stay silent. "That's not right," she had said aloud, her voice cutting through the courtroom. The judge, a man who would come to face her in the present day, had raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" he had asked. Emily had hesitated for only a moment before standing up, her voice ringing out with confidence. "The evidence doesn't add up. The timestamp on the security footage contradicts the cashier's statement, and the bag the man was carrying wasn't even the same color as the stolen goods packaging." The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence. The defense attorney scrambled to respond, but the judge, sensing the truth in her words, had ordered an immediate review of the case. Within moments, the trial had been overturned. That was the first time Emily had spoken out in a courtroom, and it wouldn't be the last. Now, she found herself in the witness chair, facing a judge who had already doubted her. Judge Morrow was staring at her, his gaze sharp as he spoke. "You claim you saw the entire event unfold the night of the accident," he said, his voice firm. "But your story conflicts with another witness's account. Let's test your honesty. Truth or lie?" Emily crossed her arms, leaning back slightly in her chair. "Truth," she said confidently. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Are you sure of that?" "Absolutely," Emily replied, her tone unshakable. The judge tapped his pen against the desk, seemingly trying to think of a way to trap her. "All right, then. How many cars passed before the accident occurred?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The judge clearly thought he had caught her. He was convinced she would falter here, that she wouldn't be able to remember every detail correctly. But Emily didn't hesitate. "6," she said simply. "3 went in the opposite direction. 2 passed before the light turned yellow. The last one was a red sedan that barely made it through before the crash." The courtroom fell silent. The judge blinked, his brow furrowed as he checked his notes. She was right. The game had only just begun, and already Emily was winning. Emily Parker wasn't just another high school student with a passing interest in the law. Her fascination with the legal system went beyond a mere hobby. It was a passion that had shaped her entire life. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, she had grown up watching her mother, a dedicated nurse, work long hours to make ends meet. Her father had left when Emily was just a baby, leaving her mother to shoulder the responsibilities of raising her alone. Despite their struggles, Emily had learned valuable lessons from her mother. Most importantly, that kindness and fairness mattered even when the world felt like it was stacked against you. Her mother had always found ways to help others, even when their own circumstances were far from ideal. She volunteered at shelters, took care of elderly neighbors, and often brought food to those in need. Emily had learned early on that intelligence wasn't just about memorizing facts. It was about using what you knew to make the world a better place. This lesson had shaped Emily's approach to everything, especially the law. To her, the law wasn't just about rules and regulations. It was about protecting the innocent and ensuring justice prevailed. But, as she would soon learn, the law could also be twisted and misused, and that was something she couldn't stand. It was this very mindset that had driven Emily to start attending court hearings. What started as an innocent curiosity about the legal process quickly became a deep dive into the intricacies of the law. She would spend hours poring over legal textbooks, researching case law, and analyzing court decisions. She had an innate ability to recognize inconsistencies and flaws in legal proceedings, an ability most adults in the courtroom didn't possess. While other kids her age spent their weekends playing video games or going to parties, Emily spent hers immersed in cases, learning everything she could. One weekend, she found herself attending a simple theft trial. The case seemed straightforward enough. A man named Peter Thomas had been accused of stealing from a local grocery store. The evidence was weak, and the defense lawyer was sloppy at best. Emily watched, intrigued by the way the defense attorney kept missing critical points. He hadn't even bothered to look over the security footage properly. And that was where Emily saw the first flaw. The timestamp on the footage didn't match the cashier's statement. And the bag Peter Thomas was carrying wasn't the same color as the stolen goods packaging. Emily could see it immediately, but no one else seemed to notice. As the trial unfolded, Emily grew increasingly frustrated. She knew the truth, but it felt like no one was listening. Finally, when the verdict was about to be delivered, she couldn't hold back any longer. "That's not right!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. All eyes turned to her. The judge, a stern man with graying hair, raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" he asked, surprised by the interruption. Emily stood up, her heart racing but her voice steady. "The evidence doesn't add up," she said, her gaze sweeping over the room. "The timestamp on the security footage doesn't match the cashier's statement. And the bag he was carrying wasn't even the same color as the stolen goods packaging. It's all wrong." A stunned silence filled the room. The defense attorney fumbled for words, but the judge, clearly taken aback, ordered a review of the case. Within moments, the trial was overturned, and Peter Thomas was released. Emily had done what no one else could do. She had exposed the truth, and the case had been thrown out. That was the moment Emily realized just how powerful knowledge and truth could be. It wasn't enough to sit idly by when you knew something wasn't right. The law wasn't perfect, and sometimes it needed someone brave enough to speak out. Emily had found her calling, and she wasn't about to let anything stop her. In the weeks that followed, Emily continued to attend court hearings, quietly observing, learning, and waiting for her next opportunity to make a difference. She hadn't planned on becoming a central figure in a legal battle, but when she heard about the hit-and-run accident that had left a woman critically injured, and when she discovered the evidence didn't add up, she knew she had to get involved. The case seemed like an open-and-shut situation. A man named Victor Larson had been arrested for the crime. The evidence against him was strong. There were witnesses, security footage, and even Larson's own shaky alibi. But something didn't feel right to Emily. As she began digging into the details of the case, she noticed several inconsistencies. The timestamp on the traffic camera footage was off by exactly 2 minutes. A key witness had originally described the car involved in the accident as dark green, but Victor Larson's car was black. It was a small detail, but it didn't sit well with Emily. And when she discovered a police report had been altered, the pieces started falling into place. Someone had lied. Emily knew that if she didn't act quickly, an innocent man could end up behind bars while the real culprit went free. And so, she decided to take matters into her own hands, diving deep into the investigation, gathering evidence, and working in secret. It wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't safe, but Emily wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. By the time she found herself in the witness chair facing Judge Morrow, she had already uncovered a web of lies that reached far beyond the hit-and-run case. The more she learned, the more she realized that the case was just the tip of the iceberg. There were people with power and influence who didn't want the truth to come out. But Emily wasn't going to let that stop her. She had come too far to back down now. And as the judge prepared to continue his game of truth or lie, Emily knew that the battle for justice was just beginning. She wasn't just a witness in a courtroom anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she was about to turn the tables on everyone who thought they could control the truth. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Emily had already proven herself once with her quick and accurate answers, but Judge Morrow wasn't done yet. His gaze never left her, his eyes searching for any crack in her confident demeanor. He had seen enough in his years on the bench to recognize when someone was lying, but this girl, this teenager, was something entirely different. She wasn't backing down, and her answers were unsettlingly precise. Judge Morrow tapped his pen against the desk, a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo through the room. "All right, Miss Parker," he said, his voice calm but tinged with suspicion. "You claim you saw the entire accident unfold. You're sure about that?" Emily leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked on his. "Yes, Your Honor. I saw it all. I didn't miss a single second." The judge looked down at his notes, frowning. It was a simple statement, but something about it felt off. He had checked the weather reports for that night, and the rain had been torrential. The conditions were far from ideal for seeing anything clearly. Still, Emily had been so confident, her tone unwavering. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" Judge Morrow pressed. "The weather was awful that night. The rain was pouring, the streets were slick, and the visibility was practically non-existent. How could you have seen everything so clearly?" Emily didn't hesitate. The rain was heavy, but the headlights of the cars and the lights from the store signs lit up the street, and the security cameras across the street from the gas station, they captured the accident clearly. I could see everything. The courtroom was silent. Judge Morrow's brow furrowed as he glanced at the prosecutor, who had remained quiet up until now. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the turn the trial had taken. Emily was making a strong case, and it was starting to make him nervous. "Security footage," the judge muttered, turning back to Emily. "What are you talking about? We haven't seen any footage from a gas station camera. Why wasn't that presented as evidence?" Emily's lips twitched slightly. She knew exactly what he was getting at. "Perhaps because someone didn't want it to be seen," she said softly, her gaze steady and unyielding. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, who now looked downright flustered. The prosecution had been handling the case for weeks, but Emily had just exposed a key piece of evidence they had deliberately left out. The realization hit the prosecutor with full force. This teenager knew more than they had bargained for. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "We'll need to verify this footage," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "But I'll give you this, Miss Parker. You've been thorough." Emily leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed, watching as the judge hesitated. She wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but the stakes were too high to back down now. This wasn't just about proving that Victor Larson was innocent. This was about exposing the corruption that had tainted the entire case. The room fell silent again as the judge flipped through his notes. He had one more question, one last attempt to shake Emily's confidence. He wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. "All right," he said, a small smirk creeping onto his face. "Truth or lie, Miss Parker? You've never lied in a court of law before, have you?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Emily hesitated. It was a simple question, but it was loaded with implications. The entire room waited for her answer, the tension almost unbearable. Had she lied? Was there something in her past that could undermine everything she had worked for? Emily tapped her fingers lightly on the armrest, taking a moment before responding. "That depends, Your Honor. Are you asking if I've lied in this courtroom?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "Or are you asking if I've lied before, in other places? Because, you see, those are two very different things." Judge Morrow blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by her response. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the room processed her answer. She wasn't just answering a simple yes or no. She was challenging him, forcing him to think carefully about the question he had posed. The judge, normally the one in control of the proceedings, was now the one on the defensive. "I'm asking if you've lied in court, Miss Parker," the judge said, his voice tinged with impatience. "So, the answer?" Emily smiled slightly, though her eyes remained serious. "Truth," she said, her voice clear. "I've never lied in a court of law." A hush fell over the room. The judge's smirk faltered, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. He had expected her to waver, to show some weakness. But Emily was unshaken, as if the very notion of lying in court was beneath her. "Interesting," the judge muttered, clearly trying to regain his composure. "But we'll see how long that holds up, Miss Parker. You've certainly made an impression today, but you've also created more questions than answers." Emily didn't flinch. "It's not about the questions, Your Honor. It's about the truth." The judge stared at her for a long moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Emily had played him at his own game, turning his challenge into an opportunity to expose even more cracks in the case. But it wasn't over yet. She had won this round, but the battle was far from finished. The judge leaned back in his chair, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "We'll take a short recess," he said, before slamming his gavel down, signaling the end of the session for the moment. As the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations and whispers, Emily remained seated, her eyes fixed forward. She had already won more than she could have imagined. But there was still much more to uncover. This wasn't just about proving one man's innocence. It was about exposing the deeper, more dangerous truths that had been buried beneath layers of lies. And Emily wasn't about to stop until the entire truth came to light. The recess felt like an eternity. As Emily sat quietly in the witness stand, her heart raced with adrenaline. She had just thrown a wrench into Judge Morrow's game, and now it was time to see how far she could push this. Every move she made felt calculated, but she knew that the stakes were much higher than what anyone in that room could fully comprehend. She wasn't just playing a game with the judge. She was exposing a system built on lies, and she wouldn't rest until the truth came to light. As the murmur of conversations grew louder in the courtroom, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the events leading up to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, she had been just another teenager in a small, quiet town, going about her daily life. But then she had stumbled upon something that didn't sit right with her. A hit-and-run accident involving a man named Victor Larson, who had been arrested for critically injuring a woman in the accident. At first, the evidence against Larson seemed solid. He had been caught on camera, and witnesses had identified him as the driver. But as Emily started digging deeper, she realized that something didn't add up. The timestamps on the traffic camera footage didn't match the statements given by the witnesses, and even the vehicle description didn't align with Larson's car. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions for Emily to simply sit back and ignore. What bothered her even more was the police report she had uncovered. Someone had altered the witness statement about the color of the car involved in the accident. The witness had originally described the car as dark green, but the police report had changed it to black. A small detail, but a crucial one. Emily knew someone was covering up the truth, and she was determined to find out who. It wasn't long before she realized that this wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about something much bigger, something far more dangerous. The more Emily uncovered, the more she realized that the hit-and-run case was connected to a network of powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The Larson family wasn't just dealing with a simple case of mistaken identity. They were up against a machine designed to crush anyone who threatened the status quo. The deeper Emily dug, the more she found. She had spent countless hours in the library, combing through records and police reports, piecing together the fragments of evidence. She had even gone to the courthouse after school to sit in on trials and observe how the system worked, watching, learning, and slowly connecting the dots. And what she had found was chilling. The people behind the cover-up weren't just criminals. They were part of a larger, more insidious system that had been operating under the radar for years. As she looked around the courtroom, Emily couldn't help but wonder how many of the people in that room were part of the same system. She didn't know who could be trusted anymore. Was it the judge, who seemed more concerned with his reputation than with the truth? Was it the prosecutor, who had been stone-faced and silent as Emily tore apart the case? Or was it the defense attorney, who had failed to notice the critical pieces of evidence that Emily had picked up in a matter of hours? And what about the police, the ones who had altered the report, who had falsified the evidence to protect someone? The more Emily thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a case of corruption. It was an entire system that had been corrupted from the inside out. If she wanted to expose the truth, she would have to go after the people who were pulling the strings, not just the ones who had been caught up in the lie. When the recess finally ended, the doors to the courtroom swung open, and the room fell silent as Judge Morrow returned to his seat. Emily took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever he would throw at her next. But she was ready. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down. "Miss Parker," the judge began, his voice more measured now, "you claim to have seen everything clearly that night, even with the rain pouring down and the poor visibility. I have to admit, your testimony so far has been convincing. But I have one final question for you." Emily straightened in her chair, her gaze never leaving the judge. "Go ahead, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but full of resolve. The judge paused for a moment, flipping through his notes as if searching for the perfect question. Finally, he spoke, his words carrying a weight that made the courtroom hold its collective breath. "You've been very thorough, Miss Parker," he said slowly. "But let me ask you this. What was your personal connection to the accident? Why were you there that night?" The question hit Emily like a ton of bricks. For a brief moment, her mind went blank. She hadn't expected him to ask about her personal connection to the case. She had kept that part of her life under wraps for a reason. No one in that courtroom needed to know why she had been there. But now, the question hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. How much was she willing to reveal? How far would she go to protect the truth? The room was silent as Emily took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. The last thing she wanted was to make this personal. But there was no way around it now. She had already gone too far, and if she wanted to take down the entire system, she would have to show her hand. She met the judge's gaze, her voice steady. "I was there because I knew something was wrong," she said simply. "I wasn't just a witness to the accident. I was there because I had been digging into the case long before it happened. I knew the evidence didn't match, and I knew that someone was trying to cover up the truth." The courtroom shifted uncomfortably at her words. The judge's brow furrowed as he processed her response. Emily could feel the weight of the room on her shoulders, but she refused to break under the pressure. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "You're telling me," Judge Morrow said slowly, his voice skeptical, "that you've been investigating this case before the accident even happened?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I didn't just stumble upon this. I've been following the details for weeks, and I can prove it." The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. The judge's eyes widened, and for the first time in the entire trial, Emily saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. She wasn't just some teenager who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was the one who had been piecing together the puzzle all along. She had been digging into a case that no one else dared to touch, and now she had the power to expose everything. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "We'll take another recess," he said, his voice a bit shakier than before. "This is a lot to take in." As Emily stood from the witness stand, she couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had already achieved what no one thought was possible. But the real battle was just beginning. She wasn't just trying to expose a simple cover-up anymore. She was going after the heart of the corruption. And she wasn't going to stop until she had uncovered every last truth. The recess felt like the calm before a storm. As Emily walked back to her seat, her mind raced. She had just revealed something crucial, something that could completely alter the course of the trial. But as much as she had pushed the truth to the forefront, she knew the fight was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The people behind the cover-up wouldn't sit idly by and let a 16-year-old girl bring their empire to the ground. Emily's hands were trembling slightly, but she forced herself to breathe. The courtroom had been thrown into disarray after her revelation, and she had seen the subtle shift in the judge's demeanor. He had been shaken, his confidence slipping ever so slightly. But now, Emily was keenly aware of the forces aligned against her. They were watching, waiting for her next move. She glanced over at Daniel Graves, the attorney who had been quietly observing the trial. He was sitting in the back of the room, his sharp eyes trained on her as if gauging every word and gesture. Emily hadn't expected him to be there. She'd known him for years, but he wasn't officially involved in this case. However, as the trial had unfolded, it became clear that Daniel's expertise would be invaluable. He had been a mentor to her in many ways, teaching her the finer points of law and strategy. Daniel wasn't just any attorney. He had a reputation for taking on difficult cases, especially those involving corruption and powerful individuals. But more than that, he had an uncanny ability to navigate the labyrinth of legal procedures and uncover the truths others were too afraid to find. He had been a guiding force for Emily, showing her how to turn the system against itself. And now, he was watching her take the lead. When the judge finally called the courtroom back to order, Emily's attention snapped back to the front. Judge Morrow had returned to his seat, his expression neutral once again, though there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was visibly uneasy, shifting in his seat and exchanging a quick glance with his colleagues. The judge cleared his throat, his voice cold. "Miss Parker, I've been patient with you," he said, his gaze piercing. "But you've made some very serious claims. If you're telling the truth, you've just made this case far more complicated than it already was. If what you say is accurate, this trial could have far-reaching consequences." Emily squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on. "I didn't make this complicated, Your Honor. The people behind this case did. They lied, and I'm here to make sure the truth comes out." There was a collective gasp from the courtroom. The judge's eyes flickered with something unreadable as he leaned forward. "You think you can just expose everything with a few statements? Do you have any idea how far-reaching these people are? They have the power to make things disappear." Emily didn't flinch. "I've already seen it. I've seen how people can make the truth disappear, but that doesn't mean I'll let it happen again. Not on my watch." The judge's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for the prosecutor to proceed, clearly eager to move the trial forward. But Emily could see the cracks in his facade. He was nervous, and for the first time she felt a rush of confidence. The game had shifted. She wasn't the one being tested anymore. It was the system. As the prosecutor called his next witness, Emily's mind began to churn with possibilities. The security footage she had uncovered was crucial, and she knew that it would be the key to proving the truth. But even more than that, there was something bigger lurking beneath the surface. A network of individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. In the weeks that followed, Emily had pieced together bits and pieces of the puzzle. The hit and run wasn't just a random accident, it had been a calculated move by someone with far-reaching influence. The person driving the car that night wasn't Victor Larson. He had been framed. The real culprit, someone with ties to powerful individuals, had been manipulating the evidence to make sure Larson took the fall. But Emily wasn't the only one who had noticed these inconsistencies. She wasn't the only one looking into the case. As she dug deeper, she started to feel like she was being followed. Someone, or some people, had noticed her interest in the case, and were starting to close in. One evening, as Emily was leaving the courthouse after another long day of research, she noticed a black car parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and the vehicle was still, as if waiting for something. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had been followed before, had seen the same car a few times now. but this time felt different. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She didn't hesitate. She turned on her heel and walked quickly in the opposite direction, making her way down a side street. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. As she rounded a corner, the sound of footsteps behind her made her pulse race. Someone was following her for real this time. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the empty street. But as she turned another corner, she collided with a figure. She stumbled back, startled, only to realize that it was Daniel. He was breathless, his eyes wide with urgency. "We need to get out of here," he said, grabbing her arm and pulling her along. "They've found us." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't need to ask who they were. She knew exactly who he was talking about. The people who had been manipulating the case, the ones who had everything to lose. They were onto her now, and they wouldn't stop until they'd silenced her. Without a word, they ran. Daniel led the way, his pace quick and steady, as he navigated the labyrinth of alleyways. Emily's mind raced, trying to think of her next move. But as she looked over her shoulder, she saw the black car trailing them, its headlights flashing in the distance. They couldn't outrun them forever, but if they wanted to stop the people who were pulling the strings, they had to take action. And soon. The city was a blur of lights and shadows as Daniel and Emily raced through the streets. Emily's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sound of tires screeching behind them, the black car gaining on them with every turn they made. Daniel, with his natural sense of direction, was keeping them one step ahead. But Emily knew it wouldn't last much longer. They needed to find a place to hide, to regroup. The truth they were carrying was dangerous, far more dangerous than they had anticipated. What started as a simple act of seeking justice for Victor Larson had spiraled into something much larger. The people behind this cover-up weren't just corrupt police officers or a few shady businessmen. They were part of a web of influence, reaching into every corner of the city. And the more Emily uncovered, the more she realized that she wasn't just risking her life. She was risking everything she had fought for. "We can't keep running like this," Emily said breathlessly, trying to make her voice heard over the sound of pounding footsteps and the roar of the car engines in the distance. Daniel's eyes were locked ahead, scanning the streets as if the answer was right in front of him. "I know," he muttered, his voice grim. "We need to get the hard drive somewhere safe. But we can't let them get their hands on it. If they find out what's on there—" He trailed off, and Emily didn't need him to finish the thought. She knew exactly what was at stake. The hard drive, containing the missing security footage from the night of the hit and run, was their only weapon. If the footage was exposed, it would clear Victor Larson's name and expose the powerful man behind the cover-up. But if it fell into the wrong hands, it could be erased, just like the other evidence had been. And the people behind this would go to any lengths to ensure that didn't happen. As they rounded another corner, Daniel suddenly veered off to the right, pulling Emily into a narrow alley. She didn't ask questions. She trusted him. They ducked behind a dumpster, and Daniel pressed his back to the brick wall, listening for the sound of the pursuing car. For a moment, everything was silent. Emily could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she tried to steady her breathing. They were safe, for now. But how much longer could they stay hidden? "We need to go," Daniel said quietly, his eyes scanning the shadows around them. "We can't stay here." Emily nodded, gripping the hard drive tightly in her jacket. "Where do we go?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before replying, his voice low. "I know a guy, an old contact from my days working undercover. If anyone can help us get the footage to the right people, it's him." Emily raised an eyebrow. Is he trustworthy? Daniel's gaze darkened. In this line of work, you learn to be cautious about trust. But he owes me, and he knows how to handle dangerous situations. That was all Emily needed to hear. They didn't have time to waste, and they didn't have the luxury of second-guessing their choices. They had to act fast. "Let's go," Emily said, taking the lead as they slipped out of the alley and onto a quieter street. The black car was still out there somewhere, but they were out of sight for now. They had to keep moving. As they navigated the winding streets, Emily's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to just let them walk away with the truth. The stakes were higher now, and every second they spent running only made the danger more imminent. They needed to act. They needed to expose the truth before it was too late. An hour later, they arrived at a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and empty. Daniel led Emily inside, his steps quick and purposeful. The door creaked as it swung open, and they stepped into a dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old books, and Emily's footsteps echoed in the silence. "This is it," Daniel said, glancing over his shoulder. "Rick's office is just up ahead." As they reached the door at the end of the hallway, Daniel knocked twice, his hand steady. After a long pause, the door opened, revealing a man in his mid-40s. He had a rugged look about him. His face was weathered, his hair slightly graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Daniel," the man said, his voice flat but welcoming. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again." Daniel gave a half-smile. "I need a favor. It's urgent." Rick eyed Emily for a moment, then stepped aside, letting them into the small, cluttered office. The walls were lined with shelves of old records and files, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they sat down at the table. There was something about this place, something that felt off, but she couldn't place it. "All right, what's the deal?" Rick asked, his tone serious. "And why are you bringing her into this?" He gestured toward Emily, his eyes narrowing. "She's the one who uncovered everything," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. "She's the one who found the evidence we need to expose the truth." Rick didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked Emily up and down, as if trying to decide whether she was trustworthy. After a long moment, he sighed. "I can help you," he said finally. "But this isn't going to be easy. If you're looking for the footage, I'll need a bit of time to track it down. It won't be on the systems you're used to, but I know where to look." Emily nodded, relieved but still wary. "Just make sure it's real. No one can afford for this to get lost." Rick gave a small smirk. "You don't have to worry about that. I've got everything backed up. The real question is, how much are you willing to risk for this? Because once this gets out, there's no going back." Daniel shot him a pointed look. "We don't have time for questions like that. Just get it done." Rick nodded, his expression turning serious. "All right, I'll get to work. But be ready. If anyone catches wind of what's going on, you won't be able to hide for long." As Rick left to gather the files, Emily and Daniel exchanged a glance. The weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on their shoulders. This wasn't just a case. This was a battle. A battle against a network of powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And Emily wasn't backing down. The silence in Rick's office was oppressive as Emily and Daniel waited. The only sound was the low hum of a computer as Rick worked furiously behind his desk. Time was slipping away, and with every passing second, Emily could feel the weight of their situation pressing in on her. The stakes had never been higher. If they failed, the truth would be buried forever. And the powerful people behind this conspiracy would continue to manipulate the system without consequence. Daniel paced nervously, his hand resting on the back of his neck. He wasn't usually one for anxiety, but tonight felt different. They were so close. The hard drive they'd worked so hard to protect was their last chance, the only proof they had that could unravel the entire case. But even with Rick's help, Emily knew they weren't safe. Whoever was after them was ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to make sure the truth never saw the light of day. Finally, after what felt like hours, Rick returned. His face was tense, his brow furrowed with concentration as he held a small USB drive in his hand. He placed it on the table in front of them, his fingers brushing against the surface with a sense of finality. "There," he said, his voice low. "The raw footage. No edits, no tampering. Everything you need is on there." Emily's heart skipped a beat as she reached forward and picked up the drive. She could feel the weight of it in her palm. This tiny piece of technology held the power to change everything. It was the evidence they needed to prove that Victor Larson was innocent and to expose the real culprit behind the hit and run. But as Emily studied the drive, a sense of unease crept over her. The room felt colder somehow, and she could hear the faint echo of footsteps outside the office. She glanced at Daniel, who was already watching her with a knowing look in his eyes. "They're here," Daniel muttered, his voice grim. "We're not going to make it out of here without a fight." Rick shot a quick glance toward the window. "They can't get in here. Not easily, anyway." But his voice lacked conviction. Emily could see the doubt in his eyes. A loud bang on the door made them all jump. Rick's face paled as he shot to his feet. "Shit, they found us." Daniel didn't waste any time. He grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her toward the back of the office, toward a narrow hallway that led to a hidden exit. They didn't have much of a choice. If they stayed in the office, they'd be trapped. But if they could get to the alley behind the building, they might have a chance to escape. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't afford to let this slip away. They had the footage now, but the most dangerous part was still ahead. Getting it into the right hands. If they could get to the press, to a reporter who could break the story, the truth would finally be exposed. But there was no time to think about that now. They needed to survive first. "Come on," Daniel said urgently, pulling her through the hallway. "We don't have long." They rounded the corner of the building, their footsteps muffled by the dark alleyway. Emily glanced over her shoulder, her pulse quickening as she saw the lights of a black SUV pulling up at the end of the street. The same car they had seen earlier, the one that had been tailing them. They had found them. And now, they were closing in. "We're not going to outrun them," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're not trying to outrun them. We're going to outsmart them." He pulled her to the side, behind a stack of crates. They crouched down, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. The sound of the SUV's engine idling at the end of the alley sent a chill down Emily's spine. The people in that car were coming for them, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the alley. "We need a plan. Fast," he said, his voice low but steady. "You hold on to the drive. I'll handle this." Emily shook her head. "Number. We're in this together." But Daniel's expression was resolute. "We don't have time to argue. Just trust me." Before Emily could respond, Daniel was already moving, slipping quietly toward the street. Emily held her breath, watching as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. He quickly typed something on the screen, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Emily had no idea who he was contacting, but she trusted him. She had to. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alley. The SUV had parked, and the men were getting out. They were getting closer. Emily's heart raced. She couldn't just sit here and wait. She needed to do something. She looked at the alley entrance and saw the familiar shape of the black SUV parked just a few feet away. Her mind raced with possibilities. There had to be a way out. But the danger was closing in fast. "Daniel, hurry," she whispered, feeling the weight of the hard drive press against her chest. The men were almost upon them now. Emily's thoughts moved at lightning speed. If they didn't move soon, they would be caught. And the truth would never come out. She grabbed the small burner phone that CLA had given her earlier, her fingers trembling as she pressed the emergency dial. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had. As the phone rang, Emily felt the air grow still. The seconds dragged on as she waited for someone to pick up. Then, a voice, low, calm, and unmistakable, came through the speaker. "Yeah? Get to the alley behind Rick's office. Now," Emily said, her voice urgent. "They're here. We need backup." There was a pause, and then the voice replied, "On my way." The call ended. Emily knew that their window was closing fast, but at least they weren't alone anymore. CLA was on her way, and with her help, maybe they could finally make it out of this alive. She looked toward Daniel, who was now standing in the open, calmly facing the approaching men. Emily couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see the tension in his posture. He was buying them time. He was protecting the truth. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt like they might just have a chance. Emily crouched behind the crates, her heart pounding in her chest as she kept her eyes on Daniel. He was standing in the open now, facing the men who had gotten out of the black SUV. The tension in the air was palpable, and every fiber of Emily's being screamed at her to do something, to act before it was too late. But she trusted Daniel. He was buying them time. And right now, that was all they had. The men who had approached Daniel weren't ordinary thugs. They moved with the sort of precision and confidence that suggested they had been trained for moments like this. Emily could see the coldness in their eyes, the way they scanned the alley, looking for any sign of weakness. Daniel stood tall, his voice calm as he spoke, though his words were too quiet for Emily to hear from where she was hiding. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but he wasn't afraid either. He was a seasoned professional when it came to high-stakes situations like this. If anyone could handle this, it was him. "Don't let them get to you, Daniel," Emily muttered under her breath, her hands tightening around the burner phone in her pocket. She had already made the call, but she still didn't know when CLA would arrive. They had to make it through this moment before they could think about escape. The men were getting closer now. Emily's pulse quickened as one of them took a step forward, his eyes narrowing at Daniel. The leader, the one who seemed to be in charge, spoke up in a low, gravelly voice. "You don't want to do this," the man said. "We can make things easier for you. Just hand over the drive, and we'll forget we ever saw you." Daniel didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze with unwavering confidence, his eyes locked on the threat before him. "Who sent you?" Daniel asked, his voice cutting through the tension. "Who do you work for?" The leader's lips twisted into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's not important," he replied, his tone mocking. "What's important is that you stop being difficult. You know what happens when people like you don't cooperate." Emily clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to rush out and help Daniel. She could feel the cold grip of fear beginning to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Daniel had been in situations like this before. He knew how to handle it. She had to trust him. She risked a glance at the street. There was no sign of CLA yet, and the men were moving closer, their footsteps growing louder. Emily could hear the leader's voice again, low and dangerous. "Last chance," the man said. "Hand over the drive, or we make things messy." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, calm and collected, as if he were waiting for something. And then, as if on cue, the faint sound of a car engine hummed in the distance. Emily's heart skipped a beat. CLA was here. She didn't waste a second. She pushed herself to her feet, moving as quickly and quietly as possible toward Daniel. She wasn't going to wait for them to take him down. She couldn't. They were too close, and the truth was too important. The leader noticed her movement first, his eyes snapping toward her. "You thought you could run?" he sneered. Before Emily could react, a flash of motion appeared behind the men. CLA. She was fast, her body moving with the precision of someone who had seen too many dangerous situations. In one swift move, she disarmed the closest man, a gun clattering to the ground with a sickening metallic clang. The leader spun around, his eyes wide with surprise. He wasn't expecting backup, especially not someone like CLA. But before he could react, CLA was already moving again, her fist landing squarely in his gut, knocking the wind out of him. "Get the drive," she ordered Emily, her voice cold and commanding. Emily wasted no time. She ran toward Daniel, who was now struggling with the other two men. He didn't need her help just yet, but the fight wouldn't last long. She bent down and snatched the hard drive from her jacket, clutching it tightly in her hand. "Move!" CLA shouted as she helped Daniel take down the remaining men. With the drive secured, Emily sprinted toward the alley exit, her feet pounding against the pavement as she turned the corner. CLA was close behind, keeping pace with her. Emily's mind raced. They had the footage, but getting it out there was the real challenge. They couldn't afford to be caught, not now. The press was their next stop, but first they needed to disappear. As they reached a quieter street, CLA glanced at Emily, her eyes sharp with focus. "We've got to get to the safe house," CLA said, her tone low. "The people behind this won't stop. They'll come after us, and we can't let them find out where the footage is. If they know where it is, it's game over." Emily nodded, her hand gripping the drive even tighter. She could feel the weight of it in her palm, a tangible reminder of everything they had risked to get this far. It wasn't just a hard drive, it was the key to exposing the corruption that had infiltrated the legal system and freed Victor Larson from the false charges that had been placed on him. But the journey wasn't over. Emily knew that as soon as they handed the footage over, the real battle would begin. The people behind this would stop at nothing to protect themselves, and they were already making their move. Emily and Daniel weren't just running from the people who wanted the hard drive. They were running from the entire system, the very system they were trying to bring down. "Where's the safe house?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. CLA glanced around quickly, ensuring they weren't being followed. "It's a few blocks away. We can make it if we stay low." Just as she spoke, Emily caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. Another black SUV, parked at the far end of the street, its engine running. It was no coincidence. They were closing in again. "Shit," Daniel muttered, his voice filled with frustration. "We're running out of time." CLA cursed under her breath and grabbed Emily's arm. "We need to move now." The moment she spoke, the black SUV roared to life, the engine's growl growing louder as it began to pull forward. They had no choice now. It was time to run, or to fight back. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as the black SUV's engine roared to life. It was like the sound of a predator closing in on its prey. She didn't need to look at Daniel or CLA to know they both felt the same icy grip of fear. The hard drive in her hand suddenly felt heavier, a burden of truth that could either save or destroy them all. "Run!" CLA barked, her voice sharp as a whip. "Now!" Without another word, they were off. Their feet slapped against the pavement, echoing in the narrow alley as they darted toward the next street. Emily's breath came in ragged bursts, her legs screaming with the effort, but she pushed herself harder. She couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Behind them, the black SUV turned the corner with a screech of tires, following them relentlessly. The sound of the engine closing in on them made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to stay focused. There had to be a way out. "Where to?" Daniel panted, glancing over his shoulder at the speeding vehicle. "There's a shortcut ahead," CLA said, her voice steady even though they were running for their lives. "We can lose them in the alley, but we need to move fast." Emily nodded, pushing herself to her limits as they veered left into the alley. The walls of the buildings closed in around them, a jagged, dark maze of shadows and forgotten corners. It was the perfect place to disappear, if they could get ahead of the SUV. But as they rounded the corner, Emily heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching again. The SUV wasn't just following, it was speeding up. They were getting closer, and it wasn't just the driver who was a threat. She could see the figures of men moving inside the vehicle. Armed men. The alley ahead was a dead end, and Emily's mind raced, her thoughts spinning for a solution. She glanced at Daniel, who was still running, his face grim but determined. "What now?" she whispered. Daniel's eyes flashed with something like fury. "We make a stand." CLA shot him a look, her expression hardening. "No time for that," she snapped. "We don't have the luxury of fighting here. We need to get to the safe house now." But the SUV was too close, its headlights spilling down the alley like a predator's gaze. Emily knew they didn't have much time. If they kept running, they might make it to the safe house, but there was no guarantee they could get in undetected. If they fought, they'd be putting everything they'd worked for at risk. She stopped suddenly, holding up her hand. "Wait," she said. "I have an idea." Daniel and CLA glanced at her, both looking exhausted, but willing to listen. The sound of the SUV's engine had grown deafening now, and the men inside were getting out, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. But Emily wasn't afraid. She knew exactly what they needed to do. "Follow my lead," she said, her voice calm but decisive. Before they could question her, Emily sprinted to the side of the alley, towards an old metal dumpster. She slid behind it, crouching low, her heart hammering in her chest as she waited for the men to appear. They had to come right past her. This was their only chance. The men from the SUV were getting closer. One of them stepped into view, a dark figure moving cautiously down the alley, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Emily's breath hitched, but she held still, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, just as the man passed by her hiding spot, she grabbed a piece of scrap metal from the ground and hurled it across the alley, making it clatter loudly against the far wall. The man froze, his head snapping to the sound. "Over there!" he yelled, pointing toward the corner of the alley. The others turned, running toward the noise. Emily took the opportunity, bursting from her hiding place and racing toward the street ahead, with Daniel and CLA right behind her. "Go!" she shouted, and they didn't need to be told twice. They ran full speed, the sound of footsteps behind them still echoing in the distance. The men were disoriented, trying to track them down after the distraction. But Emily and her allies had gained precious seconds that could make all the difference. They burst onto the main street, dodging cars and pedestrians as they sprinted toward the safe house. The SUV wasn't far behind, but they were moving faster now, weaving through traffic, cutting corners when they could. CLA led them down a narrow alley that seemed to be the entrance to a forgotten part of the city. The buildings here were run down, but that was exactly what they needed. No one would expect them to hide in a place like this. Emily's mind was racing with the implications of everything they had just gone through. They had the footage. They were so close to the truth being exposed. But they still hadn't seen the worst of it. They knew the people behind this, those pulling the strings, would never stop. They were ruthless, powerful, and desperate to keep their secrets buried. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the safe house. It was a small, nondescript building tucked away from the main roads. CLA knocked 3 times on the door, a quick, rhythmic pattern. There was a brief pause before the door opened, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man. He scanned the 3 of them with a quick look, before stepping aside to let them in. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in the safety of the house. But Emily wasn't convinced they were safe yet. The real battle hadn't even begun. They had the footage, but now they needed to find a way to get it into the right hands. And they had to do it quickly, before the people who wanted to bury the truth could catch up with them. "Do you have anyone who can get this out to the press?" Emily asked the man, her voice sharp with urgency. The man nodded, his face grim. "We have contacts. They'll be able to help. But we'll need to be careful. The people you're up against, they don't play by the rules." Emily took a deep breath, glancing at Daniel and CLA. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. The safe house felt more like a temporary refuge than a place of true safety. The door had just clicked shut behind them, and the weight of what they had accomplished and what still lay ahead was pressing down on Emily. They had the footage, the damning evidence that could finally free Victor Larson and expose the corruption that had been lurking in the shadows for so long. But getting that truth to the world was a different story altogether. The man who had let them inside, a contact of CLA's named Rick, was already working his way through a maze of phones and computers, setting up a secure connection. He knew the stakes as well as anyone. Emily paced the room, her nerves on edge. Her fingers kept brushing the hard drive in her pocket, the heavy responsibility of it gnawing at her. Every step they took felt like a countdown to the next obstacle, the next danger. The people they were up against weren't just corrupt officials or crooked lawyers. They were power brokers with the ability to make things disappear, and they had the means to hunt them down. "You need to breathe, Emily," CLA said, her voice firm but gentle as she watched the younger girl. "We've done everything right. Now we just need to make sure we finish it." "I know," Emily replied, but her voice betrayed her anxiety. I keep thinking we missed something, that there's a loophole we didn't account for." Daniel, sitting nearby, leaned forward. "You've done everything you could. Now it's up to the people who will back us. The rest, it's out of our hands." Emily met his gaze, his calm confidence a stark contrast to her racing thoughts. "I don't know how you do it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't have a choice," Daniel replied, "and neither do you." He was right. She couldn't stop now. They had already come so far, fought so hard for this moment. Emily had seen the dark underbelly of the system, and she wasn't going to let it win. Rick finally looked up from the array of screens. "The feed's secure. We're ready to go." Emily took a deep breath. It was time. "Do it," she said. Rick didn't hesitate. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, sending the footage to several secure channels, encrypting it before pushing it out to a trusted journalist network. It wouldn't be long now before the story broke, before the world knew the truth. Emily's mind kept replaying the faces of the people she'd encountered during this journey. The judge, the prosecutor, the people behind the cover-up, the way they had manipulated everything, all the lies they had used to twist reality. The idea of them getting away with it made her sick. But now, they wouldn't. For a moment, everything was still. The sound of Rick's typing was the only noise in the room as they waited for the final confirmation. Then, the phone rang. Rick picked it up quickly, his face going stone cold as he listened. Emily's stomach dropped at the change in his expression. Whoever was on the other end of the line wasn't a friend. When he hung up, he turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "It's out," he said simply. "And?" Emily asked, trying to mask the anxiety in her voice. "It's already making waves," Rick said. "They're starting to react." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She could almost hear the distant roar of a storm gathering on the horizon. The truth was out. There would be no going back for any of them now. But there was more to it. The phone call had been the confirmation they needed, but there was one thing Emily still wasn't prepared for. "The Locke family," Rick continued, his eyes flickering with caution. "They're already moving. They know what's coming. They're coming for you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had expected retaliation, of course, but hearing it so plainly made it real. "They'll be here soon. It's only a matter of time," Rick added, his voice grim. "You need to leave. Now." Before Emily could respond, the door to the safe house burst open with a deafening crash. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The worst part about this fight wasn't the chase or the danger. It was the unknown. The figure who entered the room wasn't a shadow or a ghost. It was a man. A tall, muscular figure in a dark suit, the unmistakable gleam of danger in his eyes. "CLA," the man said coolly, his voice sharp as steel. "I didn't expect you to be involved." Emily's pulse spiked. This was it. They had come for them. "Stay back," CLA warned, her voice low and steady as she stood between the man and Emily. The man smirked, his eyes flicking briefly to Emily. "You don't have what you think you do. That footage? It's not going to change anything." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The truth was out there. It had to mean something. "It will," she said, her voice strong. "It's too late to stop it." The man's smirk faltered, but his composure remained unbroken. "You think you've won? You've only made it worse for yourselves." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the man reached into his jacket. Emily's hand shot to her pocket, where she felt the hard drive pressing against her skin. There was no way they could let him get to it. They couldn't back down now. "We don't have to do this," CLA said, her voice calm but dangerous. "This ends here." But the man's cold eyes never left Emily. He was looking at her like she was the only one standing in the way of his empire. "It's not over yet," he said. "You can't fight this battle alone. But I'm afraid you'll learn that the hard way." Just as the tension reached its peak, the door behind him slammed open. A different figure stepped into the room, this time someone who wasn't part of the Locke family. It was a police officer, his uniform unmistakable. "This is over," the officer said, stepping forward with a badge in his hand. He looked at the man in the suit, and then at Emily. "We've been watching. You're under arrest." The man in the suit froze, his gaze flickering between the officer and Emily. But before he could react, the officer's hand moved to his weapon, and the tension in the room cracked like a thunderclap. "I think you've lost," the officer said with a cold smile. Emily's chest felt lighter for the first time in weeks. The system they had been up against had crumbled. The truth had won. With the final truth exposed, Emily and her allies had survived. Though the road ahead was still dangerous, they had made their mark. The system would change, and the people who had hidden behind their power would now face the consequences. The battle was over, but Emily knew one thing. Justice was never final. It was something that had to be fought for every day, and she would be ready.